Hi, everybody. I'm Sammy Bouchemaze. Really has been a fantastic conference so far. I really appreciate what everyone has presented and said. It really resonates a lot with my work. I'm going to do something similar to what we did yesterday. We're going to do some participation and singing, but I'm going to speak a little bit more about the politics of what I'm doing today. I'm going to be presenting an excerpt really from an unpublished paper that I'm calling right now The Politics of Musical Scales and the Decolonization of Music Studies, but it's like 20,000 words, so present the outline of it. I feel like to introduce myself, I should contextualize, since I'm speaking about decolonizing music studies, I should contextualize myself as a Palestinian American who grew up in the States, disconnected from my own heritage, studied Western classical music, and who I decided in my early 20s that I wanted to be reconnected to that cultural heritage, so I traveled to Egypt and Syria and studied music there. And that for me, the process of decolonization is very personal because I had to decolonize myself. I came in with Western assumptions. I studied Western music theory. I learned music from notation. And I went through a whole process by which I learned how to learn music by ear. I learned what oral tradition was, immersed myself in it, and then started to question all the assumptions I had from Western music. So that's my introduction for myself, my context of who I am. But let's start by singing. Everyone stand up, please. So I'm going to review a little bit of what I said yesterday, for those of you who were not here yesterday. And the first thing to say is that Maqam comes from the body. It's not an abstraction. It's a physical skill, like dancing or cooking or anything else we do with our bodies. So let's start by paying attention to our bodies. Take a deep breath. Notice the feeling of your feet on the ground. How does your back feel? These were like really intense emotional presentations. Do you feel the resonance of what you just experienced? Do you feel it in your body? Feel your nose. The backs of your knees. Let's take another deep breath. Now let's shake it off. Ah! Ah! Make crazy sounds. Come on. Use your voice. Dance around, jump around if you want to. And now let's do laughter, because again, laughter activates the diaphragm. Ha ha! Put your hand on your diaphragm. Experience. Feel your stomach jiggling. And let's now settle down for a minute. Notice your legs. Feel the weight on your legs. Feel your heartbeat. Feel your breath. And let's start to make sound from that feeling in your body and with your diaphragm. So repeat after me. Ya li, ya li. Ya li, ya li. Jins Bayati. Can everyone say Jins Bayati?
Jins Bayati.
To review, Jins comes from the Greek word genus. The Arab theorists adopted that term. When they were translating from the ancient Greeks, they adopted the Greek tetrachord theory like 1,200 years ago. Ya Lili, ya Lili. And the jins for me is more than just the intervals, more than just the notes. It is also the melodic vocabulary that we're using. As I said yesterday, this is like a language class. This is like Spanish class. I'm teaching you the words, the melodic words of the language. When we make larger melodies, we are making them exactly the same way we make sentences in spoken language. We are building sentences from words. We're building paragraphs from sentences. The jins also has a particular mood, which is somewhat subjective. But what is salient, what's important in Arabic music is this contrast among moods. So I'm going to change the mood in just a moment, and I want you to sort of notice how it feels. So here we are in Jins Bayati. Ya Lili, ya Lil. Ya This is Jins Ajam. Can everyone say Jins Ajam?
Jins Ajam.
Ya Layli, ya Layli. Each other. Ya Layli, ya Layl. Ya Layli, ya Layl. Ya Layl. Rust. Do you feel the difference between, let me just play for you for a moment. Here's Rust. And here's Nahawan. Feel a difference in the mood? Anyone want to compare and contrast? What does Rust feel like? What does Nahawan feel like? Give me nice adjectives. No? Come on, Lula.
Rust has like a kind of different, almost hope feeling in it.
Like a spring.
And the Hawand is a little bluesier, maybe. I mean, Rust is kind of bluesy too,
Yeah.
in a different way.
The important thing is that you sense the difference. And I'm going through this really fast because we spent a lot of time with this yesterday. But Rust was the main jins of the Maqam we did yesterday, Maqam 69. That was the bottom jins. Now it is the secondary jins. We're moving to it as a later part of this Maqam Bayati program. So the ajnas, each one has its own identity. I gave the example of we identify each like we identify a person or a friend. And in Arabic music, it's the drama, the contrast among these different ajnas that gives us the story of what a maqam is. So far we've done 4, Bayati, Ajam, Rust, Nahawan. I'm going to throw one more at you. But let's continue where we were. Bayati, Ajam, goes through some but not all of these. You guys can sit down for a minute. يا حلو يا مسليني يلي بنار الهجر كويني يا حلو يا مسليني يلي بنار الهجر كويني املى المدام يا جميل وسقيني يا عيني من كتر شوقي عليك ما بنام يا حلو. This is a popular Syrian wedding song. Ya hello, oh beautiful one, you who makes my friendship or I'm connected to, but from you who with the fire of love burned me. And then from all of my longing for you, I can't sleep. So, ya hello, ajam. You hear that ajam mood? Ya hello, ya msallini tanahawan yalli binar al-hagri kawini. So it's going between the ajam and the nahawand. Ya hello, ya msallini yalli binar al-hagri kawini imla al-mudam. So we're in the nahawan. يا جميل اسقيني بياتي من كتر شوقي عليك هجاز بياتي. So we have عجم نهوان بياتي هجاز بياتي. So in one simple folk song, we are going through 4 different ajnas. We discussed this in detail yesterday, so the point I want to make here is a couple. One is that the structure of Maqam is not a scale that has a bottom and a top half. That this description from ancient Greek music theory is not accurate. That you just have one tetrachord and another tetrachord and that makes the scale. What we see in actual repertory is this movement among these ajnas. Frankly, you hear the same thing in Persian music, Turkish music, Greek music, etc. So this is one way in which the theoretical understandings that we've been given do not match the repertory. I prefer to approach theory by looking at repertory. And the other things that I wanted to say to bring to review what we said yesterday is that this structure is not a structure that someone just invented on paper for some reason. It is a language spoken by a community. So the patterns of movement that we're seeing from one jins to another are there because of the community. Because someone decided to do it and other people imitated it. And they copied it and they shared it. So the structure itself arises from the communal interaction. It is cultural knowledge, just as language is for us. Spoken language is cultural knowledge that individuals contribute to, but is not the invention of individuals. It is a shared body of knowledge that evolves over time, that is changeable, and that is basically inseparable from the community. The community doesn't exist, if people are not exchanging this information, the Maqam does not exist. So, to summarize from yesterday, the Maqam is in the body and it's in the community. It is structured by the physical interactions of people, by the physical body, by the physical instruments and the constraints of those instruments. And it arises from that. So I'm going to get into the topics today. And I want to start with sort of what's going to be my little opening statement on this paper. Why should a painter or fashion designer favor the purest versions of every color rather than complex blended colors? Doesn't each artist make their own choice of colors from the infinite spectrum of possibilities? Yes? No? Does everyone have to use only pure red, only pure yellow in their visual art, or no?
Hell no.
Hell no. We must think of musical scales and pitch in this way, especially when we look at musics from non-European cultures, recognizing the influence of instrument and musical system on design on pitch, an infinite spectrum of possibility with aesthetic choices that don't obey rigid mathematical rules. The representation of scales as mathematically determined is inherently political, creating hierarchies of correctness and authority. When applied in a colonial situation, these assertions of authority through mathematics are a tool of white supremacy, creating the conditions for exploitation and appropriation, denying agency to musicians and decolonized peoples, and enabling cultural erasure, one of the accomplices to genocide. So that is the theme for today. So I want to start with 1932. In 1932, Egypt, Cairo, hosted the first international conference on Arabic music. This was sponsored by the Egyptian king. Of course, they were still under British colonial rule, but it was an Egyptian effort. And musicians from all over the Arab world came to this conference. There was a very productive musical exchange from Iraqi musicians coming. Some of the Egyptians heard Iraqi music for the first time. Iraqi music is somewhat different than Egyptian music. There's a number of recordings, so there's a lot of value that came out of this conference. Some famous Westerners were there. The composer Bela Bartok was there. The scholar Henry George Farmer was there. One of the efforts of this conference was to fix the Maqam scales. So what do they mean by fixing? To regularize, to systematize the Maqam scales. The idea was that the Maqam scales themselves were too messy and needed to be systematized. So let's talk for a moment about the messiness of Arabic scales. So first of all, in what we were just doing today, we have Bayati. This note, so I'm playing on B. This is roughly a C half sharp. Can you sing? Now, if I'm going to sing a different scale, Rus on A. Do you hear that that note is slightly different?
A little sharper?
A little bit sharper. Right, here we have the Bayati, C half sharp. And here's Rus. Okay, slightly different. We're talking about 4 or 5 cents, but you guys can hear it. Okay? I have a video you guys can find on YouTube where I demonstrate that between one semitone, I have approximately 12 different pitches. Right? So here's like, for example, a super low C natural. If I do Bayati on this note, hear this note. But if I do Nahawan on this, that would be another C natural. If I do Kurd, still another higher note. I have multiple flats, I have multiple half flats, I have multiple naturals, right? I have. So, are there 144 divisions of the octave? No. These are not evenly spaced. The other part of the messiness is this. So I'm talking about within one cultural tradition, within Egyptian music, you have these intervals. And if I sing Rus in Egypt, we were doing this song yesterday. Sing with me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. If I sing a Syrian song, Sayyid al-Asari yasamak ya bunni tilab bil maya. Okay, this third note. Can everyone sing? So the same scale is using different intonations regionally. Furthermore, thankfully we have 120 years of recording. If you listen to Maqam Rust in Egypt from the early 20th century to the late 20th century, you will see that the third scale degree of Maqam Rust went down over the course of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, it's high, very closer to Turkish and Ottoman music. It got lowered over time. So what's happening, what we see in actual practice, is that the intonation of these notes in the scales varies geographically, it varies historically, and there are different varieties in different scales in the same tradition. So we have an enormous variety of notes, all of which you guys can hear and which anyone can learn by ear. So the question of the math is kind of stupid, because having something match a particular acoustic interval doesn't make it easier to sing. It is all muscle memory. You are learning, just like we learn the vowel sounds. All of you Canadians speak about or something. I can't even say it.
I don't even know what it is.
I don't even know
why
what-
Why do you keep
Yeah.
saying that about us?
Yeah,
What
so
is-
you guys can't even hear your own
Wait.
vowel, right? But to me it sounds different, right? You learn it, and I learn my vowel differently, right? We just learn it by ear. And this is muscle memory that happens. So this is why I reference the whole spectrum of pitch is possible for us. And we select music from that spectrum, and different people make different cultural choices, not based on acoustic phenomena. So, the idea that there should be a mathematical rationale for pitches, which is 2,500 years old, infected this conference. And they said, okay, well, we can't, it's messy. So, well, the 24 divisions of the octave system that people thought about to talk about chord tones isn't quite enough. So let's use 54 divisions of the octave. And this idea has been adopted in Turkish music. And Turkish musicians will tell you, yes, there's 54 divisions of the octave. The most brilliant musicians, they're wrong. Because how many arab are there on the Turkish qanun? 12 to 17. So there can't be 54 divisions of the octave. Right? Theorists don't know what they're talking about. But they assert that there are these numbers of divisions of the octave, and that therefore, okay, we're going to decide that the Egyptian one is 4/9 of a semitone of a whole tone, and the Syrian is going to be 5. They determined this. They decided at the conference. But they tuned instruments and they had musicians play. They had them try out the 24 equal tone qanun, and the musicians were like, no, this sounds like shit. That's what happened at the conference. So they kind of like failed with their effort to regularize it and systematize it. But the point here is that attempts to fix scale tuning are precisely parallel to attempts by colonialists to erase indigenous languages. There's this, right, in the North American context, we have Native children being taken from their families, being forced to speak English in schools, right? We have thousands of examples. All of you know I don't need to recite all of them. But Native cultural forms anywhere in the world have been subject to erasure and violence, and its language, its cultural forms, its means of exchange. The scale system of Arabic music is the same. This attempt to regularize and fix it comes from the same place and has the same effect. So what is the effect of it? As you know from the colonial context, if you strip the colonized person of their identity, of their own culture, you have power over them. And the power takes a number of different forms. One of them is what I would call legibility. In other words, the colonizer doesn't understand these varieties of scale. So they have to flatten them, regularize them, make them legible to themselves so that they can talk about it, so that they can describe it, so that they can analyze it. So there is this sense of power through making it legible to the colonizer. And that is essentially, this is, something that is not original to me. This is a lot of cultural studies look at this form of colonization. And Edward Said mentioned earlier, talks about how, in his book Culture and Imperialism, how the use of the idea of the superiority of a colonizer culture is a part of imperialism, and it helps with the project of imperialism. It's part of the political prop of it. Edward Said, ironically,
Yeah, exactly.
looked down on Arabic music and thought Western classical music was superior, so anyway.
Sigh.
It's complicated. So let's talk about a second level of this problem. And this goes back to ancient Greece. So we have to look at our assumptions about music theory. And the first assumption is the neutrality of mathematics. There's this belief that math is neutral, and that therefore we're discovering mathematical laws, and that is how we're just discovering something. It's out there in nature, it's neutral. The question is, where does this idea come from? And it's tied to this idea of the universality of Western culture. So mathematics, the Westerners discovered, Western culture is universal, is the idea of the colonizer. And mathematics is part of that. So All we're doing is we're matching the mathematical truth. That is the view of Western music theory as applied not only to itself, but to the rest of the world. I'm going to read some direct quote. Second level of my critique here is that the practice of making scales legible to the standards of Western music theory is more insidious and subtle because it adopts the neutrality of mathematics as a screen. The framing is that it is mathematics, not European culture, that Arab musicians need to conform to. The Europeans have simply discovered the mathematical principles and are helping the field of Arabic music by disseminating that knowledge. Such a view can also be embraced by the rationalists in the Arab tradition who will take it one step further. Since the Europeans learned the mathematical principles of music from the Arabs themselves, the process is simply a continuation of the great tradition of Near Eastern rationality, science, and mathematics, which extends from the ancient Egyptians to the ancient Greeks, to the medieval Arabs, to the Europeans, back to the contemporary Arab world. Ancient Egyptians, because where did Pythagoras learn about scales? From ancient Egypt and from the Babylonians. So there's this mathematical idea that precedes Pythagoras, but what is Pythagoras' innovation? Pythagoras' innovation in music theory is not the discovery of harmonic intervals in integer ratios. That was known by the Egyptians. Pythagoras' innovation is making it into a cult. Okay? There was a cult, if you can look this up, the Pythagorean cult in ancient Greece, which worshipped mathematical ratios and believed that the entire universe had a mathematical harmony and that is what had to happen. So it was a religious belief that these musical scales must be the true versions, are the ones that match this mathematical ideal. So this gets an additional prop in the ideas of Plato, and I'll again quote myself. Plato explicitly equates mathematical purity with aesthetic and political correctness. He has Socrates state in the Republic that certain musical modes, scales, should be prohibited by the state, that the Lydian mode, expressive of sorrow, should be banished, that Ionian melodies, expressive of drunkenness and softness and indolence, should be banished, that only Dorian and Phrygian melodies should be permitted. He states that, quote, panharmonic scales and complex scales should not be permitted. He believes music should encourage manliness and virtue, and is an important tool of education and of the regulation of social life. Implicit in Plato's writing is a simple fact. Complex, panharmonic, ornamental, quote-unquote, microtonal music did already exist in actual musical practice, because if it didn't, there would be no reason to prohibit it. There would be no reason to force conformity to the Pythagorean numerical ideals if the music played in ancient Greece and the ancient Near East were already conforming to those ideals. So plainly it didn't. So we can see that dating back to the earliest music theory in the Western world, the dichotomy between theory and practice already existed, and this dichotomy was never neutral. It was and is explicitly political, carrying an agenda of purification from the messiness and complexity of actual practice. So, this is the beginning of the trend to mathematicize as a form of power. So, we have this Platonic ideal. What the Platonic ideal is that reality is messy and that there are ideals. And we have to find the ideals. Mathematics is simply one form of it, but mathematics is the purest form of it, right? So we can really make everything pure through mathematics. And ironically, what happens in the history of music theory in Europe is that this belief that musical scales are based in mathematics remains even when the harmonic ratios change. So we have the evolution of equal temperament and different forms of temperament in the West, where we're no longer using just intervals based on pure harmonic ratios, but still it's based in math. Logarithmic scales now, or different calculations. So there's still this belief that it is mathematics that is guiding the scale rather than what is actually happening. Think about the evolution of scales in Europe. There were cultural reasons to change the scale from just intonation to different forms of temperament, eventually to equal temperament. There was a desire to modulate in different ways. in those scales. There was the construction of keyboard instruments. So the physical construction of instruments, the shape of the instruments, the way that music is made, and the desires to modulate in specific ways guided, then a solution was found in mathematics. It's not that the math guided it, it's that there's a cultural, social choice that's being made, and mathematics is being used to rationalize it. So it's still not math. However, there is a second effect of this, which is the math is difficult. The math is misunderstood. So math becomes a tool of gatekeeping. It creates a mathematical priesthood of music theorists who know more than actual music practitioners. This mathematical priesthood, it's like Ptolemaic astronomy. So, as you all know, Ptolemy developed an astronomy based on the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, and everything rotated around the Earth. He then created a mathematics around that. The mathematics is horrendously complicated because the Earth is not the center of the solar system, let alone the universe. So there's this very complicated math that you have to do to figure out Ptolemaic astronomy, and nobody can understand it except a few elites. And it's wrong.
Why waste your time?
So that is 2,500 years of music theory. Okay? Is essentially Ptolemaic astronomy. Is this idea that we have these things that are mathematically justified and that very few people can understand them, and they create systems that rationalize themselves. And those who understand the system join the priesthood, get academic positions all over the world, and those who don't are denigrated. So what we have as a result is the erasure of differences in multiple cultures. So what I describe as happening in Arabic music in the 1930s, actually starting from the 19th century to the 20th century, it happened in America to black musicians. The idea of the blue note is essentially the idea that they're not really playing that note. There's something wrong, it's off, they're sliding from it. It's not really that note. So microtonality in black music was erased. Partly the use of equal-tempered guitar instruments erased the inherent microtonality from the blues. You can still hear it in recordings. If you hear recordings, but those musicians who do those recordings, like Son House and so on, they're uneducated because they learn by ear. They didn't learn through notation. I'll talk about that in a moment. There are examples of this. I learned from a couple years ago, I spoke to some musicians in Calabria in Italy who were like, yeah, after World War II, our microtonality was erased. I've heard it from Greeks. I've heard it from, you can hear it in all kinds of American music, hear it in Swedish fiddling. There's microtonality all over the world, and the regularization of it due to like, let's conform to the Western scale, let's conform to a mathematically rational scale, erases cultural difference. And so that is this use of mathematics to say, those who get the math are right, and everyone else who is, who's a practitioner is ignorant, uneducated. So I want to propose another framework, and I alluded to this yesterday, another framework for thinking about music and how musical scales are constructed and how we determine these things. And my framework comes from Saussure and comparative linguistics. So Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, was the first really linguist to articulate the idea of comparing different cultures' language forms. And before Saussure, linguistics was very Platonic in the sense of finding the correct version of a language. After Saussure, we start to recognize that languages, there's no one correct language. There's dialects that are no different from the master language in quotes. And Saussure created he didn't come up with the idea of arbitrariness. He took it from Charles Sanders Peirce, an American theorist, but he brought it to linguistics and the idea of the arbitrariness of the sign. So arbitrariness is a very important concept here. Arbitrary, in English, people colloquially think, oh, it's just random. It's just something that doesn't have a rationale. In linguistics, it has a very technical meaning. It means selected or chosen. And it means also culturally selected. So the idea of the arbitrariness of the sign specifically is that there's nothing about the word paper that comes from this paper. What's the word wada in Arabic is what this is. I don't know what this is in Canadian English, but anyway, sorry. So there's nothing about this that says it has to be paper rather than wada. So there's an arbitrary connection between the thing signified and the sign, which is the word. But this arbitrariness extends beyond simply signs and things signified. And this is where I bring in the ideas of information theory. So information theory is a branch of mathematics that was developed in the 1940s to describe communication systems. And it was used to analyze telegraph communication and eventually formed the basis of all of our modern telecommunications. So it was trying to find out what's the most efficient way to communicate. And I referenced this yesterday, that we use codes to communicate, we use symbols, and then we build those symbols into larger words. I illustrated that with you yesterday and today, that with Maqam, we're not talking about single notes. We're talking about melodic fragments that are held in vocabulary that are known to speakers of this language. So this is how communication systems work because of, as I referenced yesterday, because of the needs for efficiency in communication systems due to energy use. The brain is the most expensive energy-using object in the universe, so we have to be economical about how we use energy. But this same form of communication we find in DNA, meaning that there are 4 letters in DNA, A, C, G, T, but that doesn't mean that every combination exists. Specific words in DNA exist. So the combination of smaller units into larger units that are then stored in memory is a feature not simply of human communication, but is a feature of life communication. And it's dependent on energy, it's dependent on certain things that we won't get into, but if you're interested, issues of noise and redundancy in communication. Redundancy is very important in symbolic communication. So what do we learn from comparative linguistics? One thing is that there's no master language. That all languages, each speaker of their own language is speaking correctly in their own grammar. There was a fascinating political, and I reference this as political because there was this idea in America that Black Americans spoke bad grammar. When linguists actually studied the grammar of Black Americans, they coined this term BEV, Black English Vernacular. They discovered that Black people spoke in better grammar within their dialect than college-educated white people spoke in their dialect. Their grammar is more correct. When you recognize the comparative nature that there's no one master language and that people are speaking in different dialects and different versions of the language, you then start to see that something that is a way of denigrating people politically because they don't speak the master language has no basis in actual reality. And that's what I'm talking about with music. The challenge here that we have philosophically is a concept also from Saussure called the mutability and the immutability of the sign. The idea here is that our language we inherit, we believe it is universal. We believe it's given by God because it comes from our forebears and we can't change it. I'm using words that you all know, that I know. I can't make up new words and then you guys suddenly understand what I'm saying. So the individual can't change the language. So it seems immutable. It seems eternal. However, language changes over time. It is in fact mutable, but it is hidden from the speakers of it. That feature of language is what led people, obviously there's political reasons, right? There's desires to colonize, there's belief in the inferiority of the other, but there is an inherent psychological and philosophical basis in the way that we cognitively experience language that makes us believe that our language is true and is handed down. And only when you do comparative linguistics do you start to see that oh no, there's differences and that people do things differently. The problem then with music academia is that music is not truly comparative in academia in the way that linguistics is. Music still remains essentially locked into a Platonic view because we have musicology and music theory and music composition, and then the rest of the world all in ethnomusicology, right? So there's no real comparison that's happening in academia. So music theory is still 100 years behind linguistics philosophically. Perhaps more. This is another prop for power, for institutional power. So another level of this that I encounter a lot is over the years that I've been kind of putting educational materials on Arabic music on the internet, people reach out to me and are like, can you tell me the rules for Arabic music? Can you tell me the rules for Maqam? What's the rule? How does it follow? And the assumption that there are rules, I would say, is related to this Platonic fallacy, that there is some truth, and that the role of music theory is to discover the rules of music. That's what we believe the idea of music theory is, to discover what is really going on in music. That's what music theory is for, right? What is really going on? So, let's sing it again. Stand up here. To be feeling that you're familiar with some of these melodies already. Yes? We've done them, we did them earlier before we were talking. That familiarity means that you're starting to learn these melody words. Now, if instead we had a framework where I said, okay, in Maqam Bayati, you're supposed to go from this note to that note. Well, if I say I'm supposed to go from this note to this note, well, there's 1,000 ways to do that. I go, those don't sound like Arabic music. So I say, okay, we have to go up in the scale, right? I could make any number of rules to try to define this, but the reality is that there's specific vocabulary items that you have to learn, and that's what it is. It is this vocabulary that is making it up. So the idea of rules is an idea of reduction. Oh, we can simplify, but there's no simplification. So again, think about spoken language. How many words that I used today? How many different words did I use in speaking with you today? You can't come in, if you're not a speaker of English, and say, well, I learned the rules of how to generate English words. It's ridiculous. I generate English words by taking this letter and then moving to that letter. No. That both creates too many possibilities and too few possibilities. The existence of words in language are arbitrary. Using this word again. They are selected and they are learned. This is an important concept from information theory as well. That it is a code that is remembered exactly by the sender and by the receiver. So there is no reduction possible. You can sit down again. I like making you sit down and stand up.
You're like a priest in church.
So essentially, what I'm saying is that there is a large amount of information content in a musical system, just like there's a large amount of information content in a language. We're storing this enormous amount of information content in our brains. You all have heard the 10,000 hours idea of mastery. 10,000 hours to learn a skill, to learn a language, to learn a musical system. How many decades, Mr. Daly, how many decades did it take you to learn Cretan music? How many decades did it take you to learn Cretan music?
Well, I've been working on it for 6 and I'm still studying.
Right? There's so many details, right? I'm a man in my late 40s. I still learn a new word every once in a while in English. Right? There's a huge amount to learn that can't be determined by saying, oh, this is the rule, that's what generates it. No, someone came up with the rule, someone came up with the word, and that's what it is. And so this is where you get to the political side of it, again. If the reality of the musical language is that there's this enormous amount of vocabulary, but the Westerner comes in and says, well, let's find the rules, it is an idea of simplifying it to have power over it. Now, this same phenomenon happens internally. So what is happening in the West with Westerners describing their own music is an internal colonization by music theorists of music practice. But in the colonial context, you're saying essentially, oh, this Maqam stuff is really simple. Anyone can learn Maqam. You don't have to spend 10 years. Just learn the scales, and like you learn a few rules. Oh, you go from Jins Bayati to Jins Rast and then Jins Nahawand, and then you're good. So there's this idea of simplifying it to make it easier for Westerners to appropriate. So again, simplification, defining something in terms of rules, is a form of power. It's a form of trying to make something that we can define it, right? Define, make legible, make understandable. To whom? Make legible to someone who doesn't get it because they didn't learn the language. Right? So if you're trying to define something in that way, it's automatically coming from this outside context because the language can't be reduced. You want to learn Maqam? You have to learn all the vocabulary of Maqam. That's what Maqam is. Maqam is not like I wrote these notes out and I wrote this set of scales and a set of rules that you can put in the book. Yes, I wrote a book. What do I say in the book? You need to study orally. That's why we wrote the book. Because people need books in academia. So we wrote in the book, here, go, put down the book and start learning by ear. That's basically what we wrote in the book. And this reductionism, I would say, applies to Western views of their own music theory, and even in classical music. So, a very interesting book came out in 2007, Robert Gierdingen, called Music in the Galant Style. And the Galant style is 18th century music, and he's referencing Mozart and the contemporaries of Mozart. And in that time period, there was an explicit reference to vocabulary, harmonic vocabulary, what Gierdingen calls schemas. These are harmonic sequences that are underlying the music, and what Gierdingen talks about in the book is how contemporary listeners to that music at the time could recognize by ear the specific harmonic sequences, and they recognized when a composition used it. So a composition wasn't just note, 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 or chord, 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 chord. It was the Romanesca sequence. I'm not remembering the name because it's been a while since I read the book. But this sequence, and then that chord sequence, and then that, each of which had a name and a vocabulary. So this was kind of radical in music theory in 2007, which is ridiculous. But essentially, he's asserting that, and he couldn't even use the word vocabulary. Like, he did brilliant work. But he has to use words like schema. He's talking about words. You can see I'm angry about this. So even this is not like mainstream in music theory, and he's describing something that we should know because it's true of music. I'm going to assert for you that this is how all music in the world works. The brain works this way. You acquire music in chunks, because everything else we're doing cognitively is in chunks. And if you go through and believe that music theory is about determining the mathematical laws of scales, and then based on that, then figuring out the mathematical rules for how notes are supposed to move, then you're going to totally miss the vocabulary. And if you totally miss the vocabulary, you have no way of analyzing your own music, which is what Western music theory is. They have no way of analyzing their own music. It is equivalent to us analyzing the words of English by simply making rules about how the letters. You can make the study of phonology, but phonology is such a small part of language. They're basically doing phonology of music and calling it music theory. They're not recognizing that there is vocabulary. And by not recognizing that there is vocabulary in music, then they're not going to look for it in other musics. So when Western music, people have this conception of a music that is rules-based, mathematically based, they have no idea that there's vocabulary, then why would they look for vocabulary in other music? Why would they assume that they have to learn the vocabulary of another musical language? They don't. So the vocabulary of these other musical languages is missed, and Western music theory neither describes Western music well nor non-Western music well. The final important point that I want to make here is about oral versus written tradition. And we know that for the last 100 years or so, notation has been the primary means of music pedagogy in the West. And in fact, non-Western music is often filtered through notation. And in the Arabic context, in the United States, I encountered Arabic music first through notation. Arabs believed that they had to use music notation in order to have their music be disseminated. Teaching people using through notation, it is used in the Arab world. It started more in the late 20th century with people using notation more and more and more. And I had a fascinating experience with notation because I came to notation as a Western, as I said. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father didn't speak Arabic in the home. He wanted us to assimilate. It was hard being a Palestinian in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. He didn't teach us Arabic. So I learned Western music, I learned Western notation. I didn't hear Arabic music. So when I first started learning Arabic music by someone giving me a sheet of music, I'm playing it as someone with experience reading music in the West and having oral categories given me by the West, trying to interpret Arabic music, so I couldn't sound like an Arab. If you take someone from Egypt who grew up in the tradition and they know how to read music, and you give them a sheet of Arabic music, they can play it and they'll sound like an Arab. What's the difference? This goes to something that Tricia was saying yesterday, which is that notation does not convey the full context of the music. But if you come in with context already, notation is a shorthand. When I was studying some medieval music in graduate school, one of the professors was saying the notation was a mnemonic. People learned the songs by ear already, and the notation was just to remind them, oh, you have these 4 parts, we have to work together on this. So the notation is super simple because people are not using it to tell them everything about the music. This illustrates a very fundamental point about notation. And I'm referencing information theory here and the mathematics of communication. I want you to think for a moment, what is missed in notation? So, scalar information, all of this detail about intonation is missed. I told you about 12 different notes and regional differences. If we invent a notation, we could invent the number of cents in this particular practice, but then it becomes unreadable. You have to have the oral context. So the notation, the intonation is missed. The specific rhythmic characteristics of music are missed because music, although it has rhythmic patterns, they're not like a metronome. music patterns. Some beats are heavier than others. We have the same beat as performed in Egypt and Syria, and the way that the doom is, how much time is allocated, it's just slightly different. When you do like an analysis of music, not through notation, but through just actually the recording and analyzing it in terms of temporal sequences, you notice that these quote-unquote equal rhythmic categories are not equal, right? So notation erases the nuance of that. It erases the cultural information, the specific. So when I talk about these differences between Egyptian and Syrian Maqam rust, it's salient culturally because you can identify a musician by where they come from. Just like I can identify you all as Canadians because of the way you speak. You can identify me as an American, right? I can identify someone from Boston, someone from Louisiana, right? You all know that. You can identify someone from a different region, from Australia, from, right? Just by that. That happens in music. You identify people by exactly where they're from because of those details. That's erased in notation. The individual qualities of the speaker, of the singer, the emotional content, the blah, 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 blah. All of these things are erased when we use notation. And there is literally an informational gap. I want you to compare the file size of a PDF versus the file size of an MP3 for the same musical piece. There's at least a 10 times difference in terms of file size, right? That's a rough heuristic for how much information is lost when you transcribe. Right? Right? You're losing 90% of the information carried by the musical sound when you transcribe music. So, all of these things that we're talking about finally have another political dimension. If we erase 90% of the context of music, and we're talking about music in journals through notation, always, notation. We have to analyze through notation. We're comparing everything through notation. You're erasing 90% of what's happening in the music, and you can't really do an analysis of the music because you're missing most of the information. So when we compare, the political side of this is that it's continuing to uphold Western hegemony and white supremacy because the use of notation in Western music has become so endemic to the music that there's a certain complexity that arises in Western music through the use of notation, right? Our use of harmony, polyphony, the details that are communicated through notation are very precise in Western music because there's this desire to communicate about it in this comprehensive way. So when you look at the notation of a Western piece and the notation of an Arab piece, well, guess what? The Arab piece looks deficient. The Indian piece looks deficient. The whatever piece looks deficient. So when ethnomusicologists and scholars are going around and they're trying to notate folk songs like this, and then, well, the folk song seems simple. The Hungarian folk song seems simple because you're notating it in a system and stripping it of context. So then this becomes something that furthers the idea that Western music is superior to non-Western music because the complexity is present in the Western notation system and not present in the notation of the non-Western musics. So I have described a number of ways in which the use of Western tools, specifically mathematics, the ideas of rules, the use of music notation have been essentially tools for Arabic music, and not just Arabic music, for music around the world, to basically put it on a lower level to Western music. So, to summarize from the political point of view, the colonizer creates power by creating standards. And the power comes from conforming to the Western system. Everyone else around the world feels that they need to put their music in notation in order to be part of the elite. And in educational institutions in the Arab world, people are taught through notation. People are in fact taught in many cases in conservatories in the Arab world, taught Western music before they get to learn Arabic music as an elective. Why? Because they looked down on their own music because the colonizers told them it was inferior, and they believed the colonizer. So there's this perpetual system of happening of the Westerners are bringing in their systems of thinking about music, and the colonized peoples are adapting to those systems and therefore adopting the view that their own music is inferior and that they have to learn Western music to be superior. This results in cultural loss because fewer people practice the music and fewer people practice it in oral tradition, right? So this description that I gave of music, of 90% of the information being lost in transcription, well, guess what? Transmission, even within a culture, through notation, loses information. And so therefore, when you lose oral tradition in music practices, you're losing the music. You're essentially losing what is happening. People are not speaking it orally, the music is dying and disappearing. So much more important for me, from my own perspective, than, say, preserving musical tradition specifically, is preserving the act of learning music by ear. Because that's how the full context of music gets communicated within communities. Just like learning language by ear. So you have this cultural loss from the use of notation and the ideas of rules-based systems and conformity to rules. And then after the cultural loss, you have further value judgments of, as I said, superiority and inferiority, because you have the cultural loss, so then you can value it as less superior. And then there's an acceptance by the colonized communities of their own cultural loss. Of their own inferiority. So it's this perpetual cycle that is just part of this whole process of dehumanizing the colonized people. I'm not saying it is at the level of bombing children in hospitals, but it is part of this process. As is erasure of language, as is erasure of cultural forms. And so when I talk about decolonization of music theory, of music practice, of music pedagogy, there's an expression I love from the black left in America, like putting black faces in high places. It doesn't essentially change the power structure. And most attempts at decolonizing music practice and theory that I've seen over the last decade have been essentially that. Let's get some non-Western people to talk about music. And they got PhDs. So I'm sorry for everyone who has a PhD. If you have a PhD, your mind has been colonized. Okay? So people who've already been mentally colonized are talking about music as the representative of the non-West. Who are the non-colonized practitioners? The people who learn music from oral tradition. Period. Those are the people who learn the music as it is, rather than a set of reduced rules. So for me, decolonization looks like basically replacing the entire music faculty of all Western academia, with practitioners of music.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. That's decolonization. Anything short of that is a perpetuation of the system that exists. And what I will say is that, essentially to tie what I said yesterday back together to today, is that cultural survival requires community practice. It requires exchange. It requires people to be sharing, just like, and again, I think about it in terms of language loss. The statistics are that there's something like 7,000 spoken languages, and that every 2 weeks a language dies because the last speaker dies. And by the middle of this century, half of the languages will be erased. We have a lot of indigenous languages that are being erased because the community of speakers is smaller and smaller and smaller. Thankfully, I know of some indigenous communities in the United States that are making efforts to reinvigorate the youth from, it's hard to get young people to speak a language when it doesn't benefit them because they have to speak English to, right? There's all kinds of trade-offs that we face when we're dealing with cultural loss and dominant hegemonic culture. But the language doesn't survive by being put in a dictionary, being put in a book, or even by being reported. It only survives when people are practicing it together. That's the only way for a language to survive. Because as I said yesterday, the language itself is the community. It is the product of the community. It exists in the brains of the practitioners. It exists in the body and in the exchange among people. So let's sing to finish off.
Yeah.
Ya Layli, ya Layl.
Beautiful you. Thank you.
A few questions. I mean, we should kind of stop for dinner, but I'll take a couple questions. Or you can find me at dinner and ask me more questions. But please, any questions? You guys are hungry, huh?
Got you downstairs.
No? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, but really I don't know how to say it. You know, it's a bit different between Eastern countries and Western countries, and about Eastern culture and Western culture. And sometimes there is a conflict between, as you told, between the university and the practicing at home. As I know, the science comes from Western countries to the Eastern countries. All right? And
I mean, contemporary science does, of course.
yeah,
I mean,
but this is the difference between the science and art.
what's the difference between science and art?
No. I want to say that the science comes from the Western culture or countries, Western world. I mean, and the art, as how can I say, most of them, or the more attractive kinds of them, come from the Eastern countries. So how can we, put a balance between these two? Because there are some masters in Iran that they say that the notation is, they disagree with notation. That they say that we have a kind of academic lessons that we just learn you by ear. Like a baby that when they are born, as you told. But some others are telling that is not acceptable, because you have to know the knowledge of the dictation, the shift, this kind of instrument that you have to learn to speak about your essence. Speak about yourself as a musician, as an artist. So I want just to ask you, how can we put a balance between these two big items? I don't know how. Did I?
Well, let me try. Let me try to address that. I will say unabashedly that it's my personal opinion that notation gets in the way of any music transmission. Even in the context when people have an oral understanding. Because notation is adding an extra cognitive step that separates you from the sound. So again, this is my bias from my own personal experience. I acknowledge that there are modes of analysis and description of the music that rely on notation. I still beg to differ from the gentleman at the morning that they are necessary to use notation, because there are ways of doing analysis that don't need notation. Notation strict, but I acknowledge that there are ways of doing analysis that use notation. Whether those forms of analysis are useful to practitioners is another question that I have. Again, I beg to differ that that analysis has value. I don't find that analysis has value, because it gets in the way of music practice. I do think that people have argued with me and saying, how are you talking about, say all music theory is shit, but you're doing music theory, right? I'm actually doing music theory here right now, right? I would say that the mode of thinking about, and I have acknowledged, I've used two particular paradigms of linguistics and the mathematics of information theory as things that, to me, are much more consonant with what I see experienced in actual practice than forms of music theory. So I acknowledge that I'm involved in theory. But most of the time, I'm doing this kind of theory because I can't just go and teach people music by ear, because people don't think that you're supposed to learn it that way, because people think that that's inferior. I'm using theory to demonstrate that theory is wrong. That's why I'm doing music theory. Because I have to prove to people that oral knowledge is superior to written knowledge. Because people don't believe it. Because people are so fucking colonized internally that they believe that we have to elevate our culture by using notation, by defining the rules of it. That's colonialism. It's internal colonization. I know you can...
You're putting all of this in black and white, and I'm probably, you said I'm going to break the colonizing the rules of not actually disagreeing, but this is a place.
Please disagree.
I totally disagree with you. I mean, this gentleman here is Iranian, like me, but you have to put his question to you in English, and you understand it. You communicate in an agreed kind of thing. Notation sometimes is on just an agreement in order to remember things. And you also criticize it if somebody wants to know more about the music.
No, I'm not criticizing you.
For example, well, I can right now say that I can go back and say, my country was colonized by Arabs. So I shouldn't listen to your music because I've been colonized. It's just I have come forth with a lot of things, and I just want to have it very black and white. And if you're, I'm sorry, it's going on, and I just find that, the fact that you say that if somebody wants to find out how the music works, the brain is ethnically colonized, the word that you just used, is an insult. Because, I started, yes, as a musician that just learned to play, and I was curious to know what the music is about, and I wanted to find out. And I don't know theory that well, but I knew enough to satisfy my curiosity. So you can't just say that my brain is colonized. I can find that as an insult. I'm sorry, but you are insulting by saying that, and I don't think it's right. It's just accepting there are different ways approaching the same thing, and I absolutely respect the oral tradition, and it's absolutely necessary. Notation doesn't replace it, not even Western art music. I go to the symphony and I criticize the performance. The note is the same thing that was to the Nordic orchestra, but the one orchestra played the one way, the other one played it the other way. So notation doesn't replace anything. Of course it doesn't, but you say that when somebody dies of the language, that language dies. Yeah, if they had written it, then there is a way of at least trying to reconstruct. It's never going to be the same thing, but at least we have something to keep it for the future. So notation is also for that, kind of a preservation of something, to have some record. I just think that there is a different way of looking at things, and I appreciate you might be wanting to be very provocative, but I just think that it should be a little bit more nuanced. That's my opinion.
Can I say, I acknowledge that you're insulted. You have all rights to be insulted, but you didn't describe in what ways you're insulted. Saying that I'm insulted is one thing, but basically describing why is it that you're insulted.
It's being implied, very clearly said, anybody who's got a PhD, their brain has been colonized. I don't accept that.
Can you explain why you think that is insulting?
I'll accept that at face value. I think that that's fair. I think that that's fair to take that as an insult. I respect that, and I will say I'm speaking about my own personal experience, and this is why I tried to contextualize myself at the beginning, which is that I was colonized. And my brain was colonized by Western music theory and by Western ways of thinking. And when I went to learn music by ear, by traveling to Egypt and giving up on music notation, and went to Egypt and Syria, I learned how little I knew. And I learned how the categories of describing music were not accurate to the oral tradition. So that assertion that I made is based on personal experience. I'm insulting my own self from 25 years ago as well. And my 25-year-old self can take it. But I'm going to stick with that assertion because it's not just true in music theory, it's true in all the academic disciplines. Western academia is a tool of colonization. That has been true in all the humanities because it is creating frameworks from a European point of view that is being used to ensure Western dominance. And the dominance of the Western university around the world is one of the biggest tools of Western colonial hegemony. So I'll stick to my assertion. I don't mean to insult you personally.
No, it's not a personal. It's just I'm saying it can be a little bit more nuanced. Exactly in the way, and I take your own analogy of language. I speak quite a few languages, and the ones I speak best are the ones that I actually learned by living in that country. I lived in Ukraine at the time that Ukrainians spoke more Russian actually, so I learned Russian really, really well. But at the same time, if I do want to write an email or a letter or something to somebody who is a Russian speaker, I had to know also how to write that. So I also had to write to learn the written way, the grammar, and all of that. But it's true that because I was immersed in it, I speak that language a lot more fluently than, let's say, Ukrainian, that I didn't know this spoke around here, and I only learned the grammar, and I never really practiced it. So it's true that the tradition, the orthodox, I'm using your own analogy, that the hearing and the ear is the best way of learning. But I also need that fundamental thing to be able to communicate and to pass on and to continue and to improve by reading other things, learning, and just getting further on. So that's exactly, so you can't say that you should be learning notation or theory or anything.
I can, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm using a cell phone, and the metals from this are coming from slave labor in the Congo. I drive a car, and the gasoline is dependent on the US military empire, and I'm Palestinian. And so I am driving on the blood of Palestinian children when I drive my car. So yes, you have to use English. That's colonization. We all have to adapt to a world in which there's a lot of colonial violence. To say that we're all colonized here right now because we're speaking in English. And that's it doesn't mean that the individual is wrong for having to like, you have to earn your living. I have to earn my living. I flew in an airplane. Airplanes are to get here. Airplanes are one of the most wasteful things in terms of energy usage on the planet. So there's a lot of colonial violence that surrounds everything that we're doing, the food that we get, etc. So I stick by my assertion. These are still colonial things. We, unfortunately, in our life have to conform to them, but my preference for myself when I'm thinking about music and when I'm thinking about these things is I have to live with that contradiction. And the reason that I present things in black and white is because they fucking bombed people in tanks. And that we've been watching, like, I'm Palestinian and I'm watching thousands of people being erased. Colonial violence, those of you who are black here, like, how many slaves were, how many people were killed in the Atlantic crossing? How many native peoples have been wiped out? This violence is very real, and unfortunately, everything that we do contributes to it and participates in it. So my preference for myself in thinking about it and in teaching music, which is what I love, and we all here are here because we love music, is to acknowledge the colonial violence that is inherent in the way we think about, talk about, teach, and transmit music. And to do the best I can. So that's what I have to say. Go ahead, and then two more.
Ross wanted to make
Ross wanted, and then I'm going to let Rula.
We have people are sound checking in a second.
Oh yeah, in a second.
So
Yeah.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
I would like to say something about notation, which is the following. That, yes, indeed, I do agree that the theoretical systems which have developed in the last century, the 20th century primarily, in the Arab world, in Iran, in Turkey, in all of the modal musical traditions, they're very much based on Western models, and they don't really serve the musicians as best they should. However, notation is not something which started there. They themselves devised various systems, quite a number of systems of notation actually, going back to antiquity. It's just that the emphasis was quite different. Nobody ever imagined that we're going to learn a piece of music from a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And so you were learning the music from a person, but you did have this thing as a reference, either as an aid to your memory, primarily as a mnemonic aid. And the emphasis was on writing it not with as much detail as possible, but with as little detail as possible.
Yeah.
For the reason that what they valued was the freedom and the ability of the musician to take this basic material and to work it into his own way, knead it so that into his own way. Knead in the sense of bread.
Yes.
Not in the sense of necessity. So there is a place for notation in this music, but it just has a totally different role. The Western world stressed accuracy in notation because of the orchestra. When you have 100 people playing together, if you don't have a good system of notation, it's not going to sound very nice.
Yes.
So I think that what we have to look at is actually the difference in emphasis on the usage of notation, what you want to do with it. If what you want to do is to standardize something, then it is, of course, it's a hindrance. If just you want it as an assistance to your memory, for example, we have the old Ottoman system, the Huparsum notation, which was from the 17th century, early 18th century, which was invented by an Armenian. And what you had was the thing called usul. This was extremely important, which were rhythmic patterns. And you would it's even reported, for example, that a composer like Abdul Qadir Meraghi of the 14th century, his new composition was just a rhythmic pattern. It didn't even say anything about the notes. But what they would do is that they would give you this rhythmic pattern. They said, here are all the notes. Spread them out over this rhythmic pattern as you wish, basically. And so there would be actually many, many different renditions of the same composition. And so basically the notation was for that purpose, was to give you some material to work with, but they would leave you to work with it in your own way, which I think is perhaps the basic difference.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I referenced that in the medieval context and even in the Arab context. Absolutely 100%. And so, yeah, to be clear, what I'm talking about is the use of notation as the primary means of dissemination. Is the problem.
A specific way of
of having it be the dominant form rather than when it's a mnemonic aid, when it's just something that helping out, then it can be very useful. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming.